What if one of the most influential religions in human history did not take its final shape from the man whose name it carries? Not from the teacher who walked through Galilee, not from the voice that spoke about mercy, forgiveness, justice, and love, but from another man, a man who never traveled beside Jesus, never listened to him teach beneath the open sky, never watched him heal the sick or argue with religious authorities, never shared a meal with him, and never saw him during his earthly life. That man was Paul of Tarsus. The possibility is disturbing because it forces us to distinguish between two things that centuries of tradition have often blended together: Jesus as a historical teacher and Christianity as a theological system. They are connected, but are they identical? This is where a Spinoza-inspired examination becomes uncomfortable. Baruch Spinoza lived more than 16 centuries after Paul. He was born in Amsterdam into a Portuguese Jewish community, later rejected by that community, and spent much of his life defending something he considered more valuable than belonging: the freedom to think. He polished lenses for a living, and philosophically, he performed a similar task upon inherited belief. He took ideas covered by centuries of ritual, authority, fear, reverence, and tradition, and attempted to grind away everything that prevented the mind from seeing clearly. His question was not simply whether religion was true or false. That would have been too crude. The deeper question was this: how does a religious idea become powerful enough to shape civilizations? How does a memory become a doctrine? How does a teacher become an object of worship? How does an experience occurring inside one human mind become a truth demanded of millions? To approach Christianity through this lens, we must return to one of its most decisive moments. Not Bethlehem, not the Sermon on the Mount, not even the crucifixion, but a road leading toward Damascus. According to the Christian tradition, Saul of Tarsus was traveling there as a fierce opponent of the early followers of Jesus. He was not approaching Christianity as a seeker. He was approaching it as an enemy. Then something happened. A light, a collapse, a voice, a revelation. The precise nature of that experience has been debated ever since, but its historical consequence is impossible to ignore. Saul became Paul. The persecutor became the missionary. And the man who had never belonged to Jesus' original circle would eventually become one of the most powerful interpreters of Jesus in history. This is the first paradox. Paul did not preserve memories of walking beside Jesus because he possessed no such memories. He could not say, "I remember what Jesus told us beside the Sea of Galilee." He could not describe the expression on Jesus' face during a private conversation. He could not appeal to years of personal companionship. His authority rested somewhere else: revelation. Paul believed that the risen Christ had disclosed himself to him. And from that experience, Paul drew an astonishing conclusion. His lack of direct contact with the historical Jesus did not make his authority weaker. In his own understanding, revelation gave him an authority that did not depend upon human instruction. That distinction changed everything, because memory is limited by what happened. Revelation can expand into what an experience is believed to mean. A disciple who remembers a teacher may ask, "What did he say?" A visionary may ask, "What does his existence mean for the entire universe?" Those are not the same questions, and they produce very different religions. The earliest Jesus movement was born inside Judaism. Jesus spoke within Jewish categories, argued about Jewish law, used Jewish scriptures, attended Jewish religious life, and addressed people who understood themselves through the covenant, the prophets, and the hopes of Israel. His language was often concrete: feed the hungry, forgive, show mercy, love your neighbor, love even your enemy, care for those forgotten by society. The kingdom of God appeared not merely as a theory about another world, but as a demand that life itself be transformed. Paul inherited this movement, but he carried it somewhere radically new. He took a message emerging from one people and made it available to the nations. He interpreted Jesus not merely as a teacher within Israel, but as a figure whose death and resurrection possessed cosmic meaning. The center of gravity shifted. The historical teacher became the risen Christ. The moral message became theology. The life of Jesus became inseparable from the meaning assigned to his death. From this perspective, Paul was doing something extraordinary. He was not simply repeating, he was interpreting, and interpretation is never passive. Whenever a human being interprets an event, the event enters imagination, memory, desire, fear, expectation, and language. It becomes more than what occurred. It becomes what the mind believes occurred, then what it means, then what it must mean, then what everyone else is expected to believe that it means. That progression matters. Spinoza's philosophy repeatedly asks us to distinguish adequate understanding from imagination. The imagination is not useless. It is indispensable to human life. It gives shape to stories, symbols, communities, expectations, hopes, and fears. But imagination becomes dangerous when we forget that imagination is involved. A personal experience can feel absolutely certain to the person experiencing it while remaining inaccessible to everyone else. This creates a philosophical problem. Suppose a man sees a light that no one else can examine. Suppose he interprets that light as communication from the divine. Suppose he then constructs an entire worldview from that interpretation. What exactly has been established? His sincerity? Perhaps. The power of the experience? Certainly. But universal truth? That requires another step, and Spinoza's lens asks us to examine that step. The revolutionary quality of Paul lies precisely here. He transformed private revelation into public theology. The Damascus experience became more than a turning point in one man's life. It became the foundation from which Paul explained salvation, grace, law, sin, resurrection, and the significance of Christ. A moment became a system. An experience became a doctrine became a community became a civilization. And this is where the original story becomes far more unsettling than a simple accusation that Paul lied. Perhaps Paul did not lie. Perhaps that question is too shallow. The greater question is what human beings do with experiences they believe to be sacred. A lie requires conscious deception. An interpretation requires only conviction. Paul may have believed with extraordinary intensity that what he experienced was real. Yet certainty is not the same thing as demonstration. The human mind is capable of constructing vast worlds around moments of absolute conviction. Religions can grow from them. Political movements can grow from them. Entire identities can grow from them. And once thousands of people inhabit the same interpretation, the interpretation begins to feel less like interpretation and more like reality itself. This is why the question is not merely about Paul. It is about us. How many of the things you regard as unquestionable were actually handed to you as interpretations? How many beliefs did you inherit before you possessed the ability to examine them? How many conclusions feel obvious only because you have heard them repeated since childhood? The issue is not whether inherited beliefs must therefore be false. The issue is whether repetition can ever substitute for understanding. Spinoza would force us toward an uncomfortable discipline. Do not despise belief, but examine its causes. Ask where it came from. Ask what emotion sustains it. Ask what fear protects it. Ask what authority benefits from it. Ask whether it rests upon knowledge, memory, tradition, imagination, or some combination of all four. And when Christianity is placed beneath that lens, Paul emerges not merely as one apostle among many. He emerges as the great transformer, the man who took the memory of Jesus and gave it a universal metaphysical architecture. The transformation was brilliant, perhaps historically necessary, perhaps inevitable. But once we see it, another question becomes unavoidable. If Paul transformed Jesus so profoundly, which figure eventually conquered the world, the teacher from Galilee, or the Christ constructed through Paul's theology? To answer that, we must place those two portraits beside one another, and the difference between them is where the argument becomes even more unsettling. Imagine two figures standing before us. They share the same name. They are connected to the same life, yet they occupy radically different intellectual worlds. The first is the historical Jesus, as presented within the social and religious world of first-century Judaism. He walks, he teaches, he eats, he argues, he prays, he confronts hypocrisy. He speaks to fishermen, peasants, tax collectors, widows, outsiders, and religious leaders. His images come from ordinary life: seeds, bread, vineyards, coins, fields, debts, fathers, sons, lamps, servants, harvests. His teaching is embedded in human relationships. Forgive the person who wronged you. Do not make public righteousness into theater. Care for the vulnerable. Do not worship wealth. Do not treat status as proof of virtue. Love where hatred seems more natural. The second figure is Paul's Christ. This figure does not remain confined to the dusty roads of Galilee. He becomes cosmic. His significance begins before individual moral teachings and extends beyond history itself. His death becomes an event affecting humanity as a whole. His resurrection becomes the center of an entirely new understanding of salvation. Human destiny is interpreted through participation in Christ's death and new life. The difference is not minor. It is the difference between asking, "How should I live?" and asking, "What happened in the cosmos through this person's death?" Of course, these two questions can coexist, but when the second becomes dominant, religion changes. Ethics acquires theology. Practice acquires creed. The teacher becomes the metaphysical center of a system. This transformation is where the Spinoza-inspired critique finds its sharpest edge. Paul never followed Jesus during Jesus' public ministry. The Christ he proclaimed, therefore, could not be the product of ordinary personal memory in the way Peter's or James's knowledge might have been. Paul's understanding depended upon Scripture, reports circulating among believers, theological reflection, and above all, the revelation he believed he had received. From one perspective, this gave Christianity its extraordinary reach. From another, it introduced an enormous distance between the historical person and the theological figure. Consider what happens whenever memory is replaced by interpretation. A remembered teacher is constrained by remembered words. A theological figure can carry meanings that no historical conversation could contain. Paul's Christ could become universal because Paul was not merely preserving biography, he was creating significance. This is one reason his message could cross cultural boundaries. A Jewish teacher addressing disputes within Israel might remain largely within Israel. A cosmic savior whose death concerned every human being could enter Athens, Corinth, Rome, and eventually lands Paul could never have imagined. That transition was a work of intellectual genius. But genius can alter what it transmits. A river that passes through new territory collects new minerals, new colors, new sediments. By the time it reaches the sea, it is still the same river. And yet it is no longer chemically identical to what left the mountain. Something similar happens to ideas. They survive by changing. Paul's Christianity survived because Paul interpreted Jesus in forms capable of traveling. To Greek-speaking audiences, Christianity could be expressed in concepts that sounded larger than Jewish national identity. To people excluded from the covenant by ancestry, Paul declared that ancestry did not determine access to salvation. To those burdened by ritual boundaries, he offered a community in which faith became more decisive than ethnic belonging. The message broke its original container, and once broken free, it could spread. But here we encounter an even deeper problem. When an idea becomes universal, does its expansion reveal its truth, or merely its adaptability? Human beings often confuse survival with validity. A religion lasts for centuries, therefore it must be true. An empire conquers vast territories, therefore its gods must be powerful. A belief is repeated by billions, therefore questioning it must be absurd. But numbers cannot transform interpretation into demonstration. 1,000 people repeating an idea do not automatically understand its causes more clearly than one person questioning it alone. Spinoza knew something about standing alone. His intellectual life was marked by the cost of refusing to surrender thought to communal expectation. That experience matters here because his philosophy asks the individual to endure the loneliness that sometimes accompanies honest inquiry. It is emotionally easier to inherit a complete system than to examine how it was assembled. Tradition gives us finished answers. Reason gives us unfinished questions. Tradition says, "Here is the meaning." Reason asks, "How was that meaning produced?" And Paul's role becomes extraordinary when viewed from that second position. The Pauline transformation can be understood through several major moves. The first is the elevation of Jesus from historical teacher into a figure of cosmic significance. The second is the interpretation of his death as more than political execution or human tragedy. It becomes a redemptive event. The third is the enormous emphasis placed upon faith and grace. And the fourth is the opening of the movement beyond the boundaries of Jewish law and identity. Together, these moves created a portable religion. That portability mattered enormously. Imagine a Gentile living in a Roman city. He hears about a Jewish teacher who fulfilled the hopes of Israel. If joining the movement requires accepting the entire structure of Jewish law, circumcision, dietary practice, and communal identity, the threshold is high. Paul lowers that threshold, not by making commitment meaningless, but by relocating its center. Faith in Christ becomes primary. Belonging is no longer controlled by lineage. The sacred story becomes available to anyone. That may be one of the most consequential religious innovations in Western history. And innovation is the correct word. Not necessarily fraud, not necessarily corruption. Innovation. Human beings constantly reinterpret what they receive. Children reinterpret parents. Students reinterpret teachers. Political movements reinterpret founders. Religions reinterpret prophets. The problem begins when later generations erase the reinterpretation and pretend that the developed system existed fully formed from the beginning. Then history becomes mythology. Complexity becomes simplicity. Change is rewritten as continuity. Imagine looking at an enormous cathedral and being told that it existed inside the first stone. In one sense, perhaps the possibility was there, but the cathedral required architects, builders, conflicts, revisions, accidents, additions, demolitions, and centuries of labor. Christianity was similar. Jesus did not leave behind a systematic theology. He left followers. Those followers remembered, argued, preached, disagreed, interpreted. Paul entered that unstable landscape with unusual intellectual force. He did something the history of ideas rewards repeatedly. He created a framework. Frameworks outlive isolated sayings. A moral instruction can inspire one generation. A theological system can organize institutions for centuries. This may explain why Paul's letters became foundational. They answer problems. Who belongs? What is sin? What is grace? What does Christ's death mean? What does resurrection mean? What happens to the law? How should communities live? How should believers understand suffering? The answers could be debated, but Paul offered something powerful: coherence. Humans hunger for coherence. We dislike fragments. A collection of sayings leaves uncertainty. A system gives the mind a map. Once the map is accepted, experience is interpreted through it. Suffering becomes meaningful within the map. Death becomes meaningful. Guilt becomes meaningful. Hope becomes meaningful. Even history becomes meaningful. Paul's genius was not simply preaching. It was architecture. He transformed a movement centered on memory into a worldview capable of explaining the human condition. Yet architecture always contains choices. Every building emphasizes some spaces and closes others. Every system highlights some ideas while pushing others toward the margins. When salvation is placed at the center, ethics may be understood through salvation. When resurrection becomes central, the death of Jesus becomes more than the death of an executed teacher. When belief becomes decisive, practice is interpreted in relation to belief. The theological Christ begins to overshadow the remembered rabbi. And eventually a strange reversal occurs. Instead of asking what Jesus taught, people begin asking what they must believe about Jesus. That reversal lies near the heart of the original argument. Christianity gradually becomes less a religion practiced by Jesus and more a religion organized around claims concerning Jesus. The distinction appears subtle, but historically and psychologically, it changes everything. Because once belief about the person becomes central, disagreement about belief becomes more threatening than disagreement about conduct. A man may be charitable but doctrinally wrong. Another may hold correct doctrine while remaining cruel. Which one belongs? The question would occupy churches for centuries, and behind it stands Paul's transformation. Yet Paul's theology did not emerge without opposition. There were already people who could make a claim he could never make. They had actually known Jesus. And when Paul's interpretation met the memories of Jerusalem, the movement faced a conflict that reveals just how uncertain early Christianity really was. The early Christian movement was not born as a perfectly unified institution. That image belongs more to later imagination than to the messy reality of new religious communities. There were disagreements, different priorities, different memories, different understandings of law, identity, authority, and mission. At the center of one stream stood figures such as Peter and James, connected directly or closely to Jesus' earthly movement and rooted in Jerusalem. Then Paul entered the story. He carried authority of a very different kind. The tension is almost unavoidable. One side could appeal to proximity, the other could appeal to revelation. One could say, "We walked with him." The other could say, "Christ revealed himself to me." How does a community decide between those forms of authority? This is not merely an ancient Christian problem. It is a universal problem of human knowledge. What deserves greater trust, memory, or vision? Tradition or new interpretation? Inherited authority or individual conviction? Direct experience or a claim of deeper insight? These conflicts occur everywhere. A political revolution begins with founders. Then later interpreters claim to understand the revolution's true meaning better than those who were there. A philosopher writes a difficult work, and generations of commentators build systems the philosopher never explicitly constructed. A spiritual teacher dies, and disciples dispute which interpretation represents the authentic teaching. Human beings do not merely inherit meaning, they compete to define it. Paul's conflict with other early Christian leaders exposes this process in unusually clear form. For Paul, the inclusion of Gentiles without full submission to Jewish law was not a minor administrative preference. It was central to his understanding of what Christ had accomplished. If Gentiles could belong through faith, then requiring them to become Jews would undermine the radical universality of his gospel. For more Jewish-oriented followers of Jesus, however, the matter was not so simple. The Torah was not an arbitrary burden. It was part of the sacred identity within which Jesus himself had lived. How could the Messiah of Israel suddenly become the foundation of a movement detached from Israel's law? The dispute, therefore, reached far beneath food rules or circumcision. It asked what Christianity actually was: a renewed form of Jewish faith, or a universal religion capable of transcending Jewish boundaries? History would eventually give one answer. But history does not necessarily reward the interpretation closest to the beginning. It often rewards the interpretation most capable of surviving. This distinction matters. We tend to look backward from the winner and assume the winner was always destined to win. But people living through the conflict did not know the outcome. Imagine Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple. The Jesus movement still carries the atmosphere of Jewish life. Its earliest leaders possess prestige because of their connection to Jesus. Paul's Gentile communities, meanwhile, grow beyond Judea. The geographic center of gravity begins to shift. Then, history intervenes with brutal force. Jerusalem is devastated. The temple falls. Communities tied strongly to that center are weakened and scattered. Paul's letters, however, have already traveled. His communities exist across the Mediterranean world. His interpretation is less dependent upon one sacred city. It can survive relocation because its theological center is not Jerusalem. Its center is Christ. That portability becomes a decisive advantage. Ideas behave almost like living organisms. Those dependent upon a narrow environment may flourish brilliantly there, but struggle when conditions change. Those capable of adapting across environments often survive. Pauline Christianity possessed extraordinary adaptability. It could enter a household in Corinth, a gathering in Rome, a community in Galatia, a port city, a merchant network, a group of slaves, a group of artisans, a group of women and men who possessed no ancestral connection to Israel. Its identity traveled through letters, teaching, ritual, and belief. This is precisely why calling Paul simply a corrupter misses the deeper phenomenon. He was also a builder, perhaps one of the most successful builders of meaning in history. Spinoza's philosophical perspective allows us to admire human creativity without confusing creativity with supernatural proof. A system can be magnificent and human. A cathedral does not become ugly because architects designed it. Music does not lose emotional power because human nervous systems produce and perceive it. A poem is not worthless because the poet created it rather than receiving it from the sky. Why, then, should religion require a different standard? This is where the argument becomes more radical. Perhaps the great fear is not that religion might be human. Perhaps the fear is that admitting its humanity would remove its authority. If doctrines were constructed historically, then they can be examined historically. If institutions were developed by people, they can be criticized by people. If interpretations changed before, they can change again. And that possibility threatens every institution that depends upon presenting contingent decisions as eternal necessities. Spinoza's criticism of superstition was deeply connected to this dynamic. Fear makes human beings vulnerable to authority. When we do not understand causes, imagination rushes to fill the gap. A storm becomes punishment. Misfortune becomes a sign. Victory becomes divine approval. A ruler becomes chosen. A ritual becomes protection. An interpretation becomes unquestionable. The less we understand, the more easily mystery can be converted into obedience. This does not mean every mystery is false. It means mystery and authority form a dangerous combination when questioning is forbidden. Paul's own conflict with Peter offers a useful example of how authority was still contested. Paul recounts confronting Peter at Antioch over behavior toward Gentile believers. Whatever interpretation one places on the episode, its existence shows something important. There was no smooth, unanimous transmission of doctrine from Jesus to a perfectly unified apostolic community. Real people disagreed. Real pressures affected behavior. Identity mattered. Social boundaries mattered. Authority mattered. Paul was willing to challenge someone regarded as a central figure among Jesus' original followers. Think about the psychological force required. Paul's confidence in his revelation must have been immense. Otherwise, how could a man who had not walked beside Jesus publicly resist one who had? The answer again leads us into the machinery of conviction. When a person believes an idea comes not from ordinary reasoning, but from the highest possible source, compromise becomes difficult. If I believe my opinion is mine, I can revise it. If I believe my opinion belongs to God, disagreement with me begins to resemble disagreement with God. This psychological pattern extends far beyond Christianity. It can appear wherever human certainty becomes sacred. And once certainty is sacred, opponents stop being merely mistaken. They become dangerous, impure, disobedient, heretical, perhaps even evil. This is one reason Spinoza's insistence on intellectual freedom was so disruptive. He wanted to separate philosophy from obedience. Religion, in his political thought, could guide ordinary moral life. But speculative truth could not be established by command. You cannot force understanding. You can force silence. You can force conformity. You can force recitation. But genuine understanding happens only when the mind sees why something is so. That difference between obedience and understanding is crucial. Paul's communities were built through powerful narratives of faith, salvation, transformation, and belonging. Those narratives could unify people who otherwise had little in common. Yet over centuries, what began as living persuasion gradually hardened into doctrine. Doctrine became creed. Creed became boundary. Boundary became institution. Institution became authority. And authority learned to defend itself. The same process has occurred repeatedly throughout human history. An original insight is born in a moment of intensity. People gather around it. The group needs language. The language becomes formalized. The formalization requires guardians. The guardians develop rules. The rules become tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity becomes sacred. Finally, questioning the institution feels like questioning reality itself. What began as awakening becomes structure. What began as liberation can become obligation. This does not prove the original insight false. It reveals something about human social organization. We institutionalize what we fear losing. Then, eventually, we may preserve the institution even after forgetting why the original insight mattered. This is the deeper pattern the Paul story symbolizes within the script's Spinoza-inspired framework. Jesus speaks. Followers remember. Paul interprets. Communities organize. Theology develops. Institution consolidate. Empires adopt. Creeds define. Centuries later, people encounter the finished structure and imagine that the structure descended whole from heaven. But history almost never works that way. Structures grow, and once we recognize growth, we begin noticing fingerprints. Human fingerprints. On doctrines. On rituals. On institutions. On interpretations. On the very idea of what counts as sacred. The question then changes. Instead of asking whether Christianity came from God or from humanity, as though only one answer were possible, perhaps we should ask how human beings produce the forms through which they encounter what they call divine. And to explore that, we must understand why Paul's version succeeded so powerfully where other early forms of the movement faded. Why did Paul's Christianity survive? Why did it spread across languages, regions, and social classes? Why did his writings become central while other voices of the early movement became faint or disappeared almost completely? The simplest answer would be providence. The cynical answer would be manipulation. Neither is philosophically sufficient. A more serious explanation must examine causes. This is exactly where a Spinoza-inspired method becomes useful. Instead of saying, "It happened because God wanted it," or "It happened because Paul deceived everyone," we ask, what conditions made the outcome possible? What made his message adaptable? What human needs did it answer? What barriers did it remove? What psychological and social forces allowed it to travel? Paul offered universality. That alone was revolutionary. Tribal religions are powerful inside tribes. National religions can stabilize nations. But universal religions cross borders. Paul helped transform a Jewish messianic movement into a message capable of addressing any person. Yeo, Greek, slave, free, male, female, citizen, foreigner. The theological implications were enormous. Your ancestry no longer determined whether you could enter the community. Your relationship to Christ did. This was not merely religious innovation. It was a new structure of belonging, and human beings hunger for belonging almost as deeply as they hunger for food. Paul's communities offered people an identity larger than family, city, ethnicity, or legal status. Imagine being socially invisible within the Roman world and entering a gathering where you are told that, before the highest reality, your spiritual value is not determined by wealth or citizenship. That message possesses enormous emotional force. It gives the powerless significance. It gives the guilty forgiveness. It gives the grieving hope. It gives the lonely a family. It gives death a narrative. These are not minor psychological benefits. They address fundamental human fears, and ideas that speak directly to deep fears possess unusual survival power. Spinoza understood that hope and fear often operate together. We fear what may happen. We hope for what may save us. When understanding is weak, these emotions can govern whole populations. Religious systems frequently organize both: fear of judgment, hope of salvation; fear of death, hope of resurrection; fear of meaninglessness, hope of divine purpose. Fear and hope create tremendous motivational energy. Paul's message placed both inside a coherent story. Humanity stands in a condition from which it cannot rescue itself. Christ's death provides redemption. Faith joins the believer to that salvation. Death no longer holds final authority. A new community emerges. History itself acquires direction. This narrative does something that isolated moral sayings cannot easily do. It explains the entire human condition. It answers not merely, "What should I do today?" It answers, "Why am I here? Why do I suffer? Why do I fail? What does death mean? What can save me? Where is history going?" That is why theology can become more powerful than ethics. Ethics tells you how to act. Theology tells you what existence means. And people will endure extraordinary sacrifices for meaning. The old Roman religious environment contained countless gods, rituals, cults, household practices, philosophical schools, and mystery traditions. Paul entered this pluralistic world with a message possessing remarkable simplicity at its core. One decisive Christ, one redemptive drama, one community open across boundaries, one hope stronger than death. Complex systems can be intellectually rich. Simple centers spread. Paul's theology had such a center, and because it was written, repeated, preached, remembered, and organized, it could reproduce itself. This is how ideas become historical forces, not because they float mysteriously above human beings, but because minds carry them. Voices repeat them, families transmit them, institutions preserve them, texts stabilize them, rituals embody them, communities reward loyalty to them. Political power eventually protects them. By the time the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, the movement had traveled an astonishing distance from its beginnings. A Jewish teacher, executed by Roman authority, became the divine figure worshipped throughout the empire that had executed him. The irony is almost impossible to exaggerate. The instrument of Roman terror, the cross, became a sacred symbol. Defeat became victory. Execution became salvation. Shame became glory. Few transformations of meaning in history have been more complete, and Paul was central to the intellectual grammar that made that reversal possible. Without interpretation, a crucifixion is an execution. With theology, it becomes cosmic redemption. That is the power of meaning. Events do not enter human consciousness naked. They arrive clothed in interpretation. Two people can experience the same event and inhabit different realities because they assign it different causes, purposes, and significance. One person sees punishment, another sees accident, another sees necessity, another sees opportunity, another sees divine intervention. The external event may be identical. The emotional world created around it is entirely different. Spinoza's philosophy tries to move us from interpretations dominated by imagination toward interpretations disciplined by causal understanding. Why? Because emotional freedom depends upon how accurately we understand causes. If you think lightning is an angry message directed personally at you, terror follows. If you understand atmospheric electricity, the lightning may still frighten you, but the structure of the fear changes. Understanding does not eliminate reality. It eliminates unnecessary illusions surrounding reality. Apply that principle to religion. Suppose Christianity is examined not as a completed revelation deposited intact into history, but as a developing human phenomenon. Does everything sacred disappear? Not necessarily. Something else may happen. we begin to appreciate the scale of human creativity involved. Paul becomes more fascinating, not less. He no longer needs to be either infallible apostle or cynical manipulator. He can be understood as a human being of enormous conviction and interpretive power whose ideas changed civilization. That explanation may be more difficult because it denies us simple heroes and villains. Human reality is rarely simple. Paul may have liberated people from restrictive boundaries while simultaneously laying foundations for later dogmatic authority. He may have universalized a message of spiritual dignity while shifting attention away from some of Jesus's concrete ethical emphasis. He may have preserved the movement by transforming it. And preservation through transformation always raises a troubling question. At what point does adaptation become replacement? Imagine restoring an ancient painting. You clean the surface, repair damaged areas, replace missing pigment, strengthen the canvas. At first you are preserving, but suppose you continue. You brighten the colors, alter the faces, change the background, add figures, remove details. Eventually, what remains of the original? The same question can be asked of every tradition. How much transformation can a message undergo while remaining the same message? Christianity, after Paul, still points toward Jesus. But which Jesus? The teacher? The Messiah? The risen Lord? The cosmic Christ? The second person of later Trinitarian theology? Each historical layer adds interpretation, and later believers may experience the final composite as though every layer were present from the beginning. Spinoza teaches us to look for causes behind these layers, not to mock them, to understand them, because ridicule is not knowledge. A skeptic who laughs at believers without understanding religion is no freer than a believer who fears questions. Both are reacting. One reacts through devotion, the other through rejection. Reason demands more. Reason asks us to remain present long enough to examine why human beings needed these ideas, how those ideas developed, what they accomplished, and what they cost. And the cost, according to the script's argument, was significant. As Christianity became a system, the living ethical voice associated with Jesus could be overshadowed by arguments about doctrine. Compassion became entangled with orthodoxy. The question, how do you live, increasingly competed with the question, what do you believe? Institutions learned to police answers. The living movement became a monument. And this transformation was not unique to Christianity. It reveals something about religion itself. A teacher speaks. The words burn. Followers gather. Memory becomes ritual. Ritual becomes law. Law becomes authority. Authority becomes power. And power begins defending the structure that originally existed to preserve the insight. That pattern brings us directly to Spinoza's deepest challenge. Religion is not dangerous merely because it is human. It becomes dangerous when humanity forgets that it helped create the forms through which religion speaks. There is a strange habit in human beings. We create something, then forget that we created it. A custom becomes ancient, and suddenly it feels natural. A social hierarchy lasts long enough, and people begin imagining that the hierarchy reflects the structure of the universe. A doctrine is repeated for generations, and eventually questioning it seems almost equivalent to questioning reality. This forgetting is one of the great sources of authority. If a rule is recognized as human, it can be debated. If the same rule is believed to have descended directly from eternity, debate becomes rebellion. This distinction helps explain the radical character of Spinoza's approach to scripture and religion. He did not need to treat sacred texts as worthless in order to refuse to treat them as exempt from interpretation. Texts have authors. Authors live in history. Language belongs to cultures. Prophets speak through imagination. Political circumstances shape communities. Readers bring expectations. Institutions select interpretations. Once these facts are acknowledged, Scripture becomes something more complicated than a voice falling vertically from heaven. It becomes a human encounter with the sacred, interpreted through human minds. That shift changes the entire relationship between reason and faith. Instead of asking reason to kneel before revelation, Spinoza asks reason to examine the mechanisms through which something is called revelation. Who experienced it? How was it communicated? How was it preserved? Who interpreted it? What linguistic or political context shaped the interpretation? What emotions surrounded it? What purpose did the story serve? Again, the goal is not automatically to destroy the story. The goal is to understand it. This is why Paul's Damascus experience becomes philosophically important. Suppose Paul genuinely experienced something overwhelming, perhaps a vision, perhaps a psychological crisis, perhaps something he understood as divine encounter. The historical event accessible to us is not the revelation itself. It is Paul's interpretation and the consequences of that interpretation. We cannot step inside his consciousness. We encounter letters, traditions, communities, and effects. That does not prove Paul wrong, but it establishes a boundary, and reason respects boundaries. Where evidence ends, certainty should become more modest. Religion often reverses this. Where evidence ends, certainty sometimes becomes stronger. The invisible is protected precisely because it cannot be inspected. A revelation unavailable to others can become immune to contradiction. A miracle witnessed only through later testimony can grow more powerful with repetition. An unverifiable claim can acquire absolute authority because ordinary methods of testing are declared inappropriate. This is the point where Spinoza's suspicion of superstition becomes essential. Superstition thrives where causes are unknown and emotions are intense. Fear asks for explanation. Imagination supplies one. Authority confirms it. Repetition stabilizes it. Soon the explanation becomes sacred. But notice what Spinoza offers in place of this system. Not emptiness, not nihilism, not a cold universe stripped of wonder. His philosophical vision points toward an extraordinary idea. God is not a supernatural monarch standing outside nature and occasionally interrupting its laws. God and nature belong to one infinite reality. Nothing exists outside that reality. Human beings are not exceptions. Our bodies belong to nature. Our minds belong to nature. Our desires, fears, judgments, and beliefs arise within causal order. This means that understanding nature is not movement away from the divine. It is movement deeper into reality. That inversion is profound. Traditional religion may say, the sacred is beyond the natural. Spinoza asks, what if the natural itself is the sacred order? Traditional imagination may picture God as a person who becomes pleased, angry, jealous, persuaded, offended, or satisfied. Spinoza rejects the projection of ordinary human emotions onto infinity. Why would an infinite reality possess the emotional instability of a human ruler? Why imagine that the universe exists to reward our preferences? Why assume storms, disease, victory, loss, or fortune are personalized messages? We make this mistake because we naturally interpret reality from the center of our own desires. Rain that saves one farmer's crops may ruin another person's journey. A storm that destroys one village may replenish a forest. Nature does not reorganize itself according to our private expectations. Yet human beings repeatedly project intention onto necessity. Something benefits us, blessing. Something harms us, punishment. Something surprises us, miracle. Something terrifies us, omen. We place ourselves at the center. Spinoza removes us from the center. And strangely, that humiliation can become liberation. If reality is not personally conspiring against you, much resentment becomes unnecessary. If events arise through causes rather than cosmic moods, understanding becomes more useful than pleading. If your emotions also have causes, then you can study them rather than merely obey them. This is where Spinoza's philosophy ceases to be abstract. Think about anger. Someone insults you. You immediately feel attacked. You imagine intention. You replay the words. You construct motives. Perhaps you tell yourself, they wanted to humiliate me. The emotion intensifies. But what happens if you begin understanding causes? Perhaps the person was frightened, perhaps insecure, perhaps repeating behavior learned elsewhere, perhaps reacting to something you did not know. Understanding does not mean approving. It changes your relationship to the event. The emotion becomes less passive because the mind sees more of the causal chain. Freedom, then, is not magical independence from causes. You are always part of nature. You did not choose your genetics, your childhood, your language, your century, your nervous system, most of your earliest beliefs. Countless influences shaped you before you knew they were shaping you. The fantasy of a completely independent self collapses under examination. But another kind of freedom becomes possible. You can understand more. And as understanding increases, blind reaction can decrease. This is Spinoza's revolution. The free person is not someone without causes. The free person is increasingly active through understanding the causes operating within and around them. Now return to Paul. If we treat Paul's theology as pure revelation, our role becomes primarily obedience. If we treat it as a human interpretation shaped by historical causes, our role changes. We can ask why it emerged, why it appealed, what it preserved, what it transformed, where it liberated, where later institutions used it for control, what remains ethically valuable, what should be reconsidered. This is not intellectual vandalism. It is responsibility. A tradition that cannot survive examination is already fragile, and a belief protected only by fear has confessed something about itself. Perhaps this is what makes Spinoza's lens so threatening. He does not demand that you reject religion. He removes religion's exemption from thought. Nothing sacred becomes less sacred merely because it is understood. If anything, understanding may reveal a deeper kind of wonder. A rainbow does not become ugly because optics explains it. The stars do not lose grandeur because astronomy replaces astrology. Love does not become meaningless because biology affects emotion. Knowledge does not necessarily destroy awe. Often it purifies awe of fear. And this opens a new possibility. Perhaps Christianity need not be defended as a perfectly unchanged message delivered from heaven. Perhaps its humanity can be acknowledged. Perhaps Paul can be recognized as an architect without making him a villain. Perhaps Jesus can be encountered again beneath centuries of theological construction. Perhaps faith itself can be transformed from submission to inherited certainty into a disciplined search for truth. But if we accept that possibility, one final problem remains. What happens to the sacred when we admit that human beings have always participated in creating its forms? Suppose we accept the unsettling possibility that religion is partly an act of human creation. What follows? For many people, the immediate answer is frightening. If human beings shaped religion, then religion must be false. If doctrine developed historically, then God disappears. If Paul helped construct Christianity, then Christianity collapses. But that conclusion depends upon an assumption we rarely examine, that anything human must somehow be unworthy of the sacred. Why? Human beings create music. Does that make music unreal? We create language. Does that make language meaningless? We construct mathematics in symbolic form, while discovering patterns that seem woven into reality itself. We create poetry, law, philosophy, art, and scientific theories. Each is human. Each can still disclose something true. Perhaps religion belongs to a similar category. Human creation does not automatically mean arbitrary invention. It may mean that human beings respond to reality through symbols available to them. A person confronted by death creates ritual. A community confronted by suffering creates narratives. A mind confronted by infinity creates concepts. A conscience confronted by cruelty creates moral language. These forms are human because there is no other language available to human beings. We cannot think from nowhere. We think through bodies, cultures, histories, image, words, memories. Perhaps the problem was never that religion is human. Perhaps the problem begins when a human form claims to be identical with infinite truth. Then humility disappears. The symbol says, I am the reality. The doctrine says, I contain the infinite. The institution says, outside me there is darkness. The interpreter says, disagreement with me is disagreement with God. That is where sacred imagination can become political power. Spinoza offers another path. Instead of denying the human origins of religious forms, recognize them, then examine them, refine them, retain what leads toward justice and understanding, discard what depends upon ignorance and fear. This is why the image of the lens becomes so appropriate. A lens does not create the light. It changes how the light is seen. A dirty lens distorts. A cracked lens divides. A polished lens clarifies. Perhaps traditions are lenses. Paul constructed one enormously influential lens through which generations looked at Jesus. Later, theologians polished parts of it and added others. Church councils altered its shape. Empires placed it inside political structures. Artists colored it. Priests guarded it. Reformers cracked it open. Modern scholarship turned it beneath new light. And still people look through it. The mistake is believing the lens and the light are the same thing. This may be the most powerful question the entire story leaves us with. Are we defending reality or merely defending our inherited lens? There is a difference. If truth is infinite, no human formulation can exhaust it. If God is identical with the infinite order of reality, as Spinoza's philosophy suggests, then no creed can imprison that reality inside language. Words point, concepts organize, rituals symbolize, but reality remains larger. This should produce humility rather than cynicism. The person who says, "I possess the final truth," may actually possess less understanding than the person willing to continue asking. Because genuine reason does not fear revision. It wants adequate ideas. It wants causes. It wants clarity. This has consequences far beyond theology. Ask yourself how many other inherited structures you treat as sacred without examination. Your idea of success. Your idea of masculinity or femininity. Your idea of social status. Your idea of family honor. Your assumptions about money. Your political loyalties. Your resentment towards certain groups. Your fear of being judged. Your belief that you must become a particular kind of person in order to deserve love. Where did these ideas come from? Did you choose them? Or did they enter your mind before you knew enough to question them? And if they entered without permission, why must they remain without examination? This is where Spinoza's philosophical courage becomes personal. Thinking is not merely solving intellectual puzzles. Thinking means investigating the forces shaping your own life. Why do you want what you want? Why does one person's approval matter so much? Why does criticism produce rage? Why does uncertainty produce panic? Why do you cling to identities that cause suffering? Why do you interpret events as personal attacks? Why do you defend beliefs you have never seriously studied? Until causes are understood, we remain largely passive. We call ourselves free while invisible chains pull us. A marionette might imagine independence if it could not see the strings. Human beings frequently do the same. We experience desire and assume, "I chose this freely." But what caused the desire? Advertising? Childhood? Fear? Biology? Social competition? Loneliness? Imitation? A need for status? Once you begin following the chain backward, the independent ego becomes less absolute. That realization can initially feel threatening. Then it becomes liberating. You stop asking, "Why am I failing to control everything?" You begin asking, "What causes are operating here?" That is a far more powerful question, because what can be understood can sometimes be redirected. What remains invisible usually controls us. The same principle applies collectively. A society that does not understand how its myths developed will be controlled by them. A religious community that cannot investigate its history will confuse historical accident with divine necessity. A political community that cannot examine its founding stories will become trapped inside mythology. Understanding does not require contempt. We can honor ancestors without pretending they were infallible. We can value traditions without freezing them. We can love sacred stories without surrendering our capacity to think. We can find meaning in Christianity while acknowledging that Christianity developed. We can admire Paul while questioning Paul. We can listen to Jesus without pretending we possess an untouched recording of his every intention. We can read Spinoza without turning Spinoza into another prophet whose words are protected from criticism. That last point is essential. The moment we turn Spinoza into an unquestionable authority, we betray the very spirit of the exercise. The purpose of philosophy is not to replace one obedience with another. It is to learn how to see. Paul represents one immense human response to Jesus. Spinoza represents another human attempt to understand religion, nature, reason, freedom, and God. Neither absolves us from thinking. The responsibility now belongs to us. And this is where the final contrast becomes strangely beautiful. Jesus, in the memory preserved around him, calls human beings toward love, mercy, forgiveness, and moral transformation. Paul turns Jesus into the center of a universal faith capable of crossing the ancient world. Spinoza asks whether the divine might be understood not through fear, supernatural interruption, or unquestioned authority, but through reality itself. Three radically different movements: love, belief, understanding. What if the future does not require choosing only one? What if compassion without reason becomes manipulation? What if reason without compassion becomes sterile? What if belief without examination becomes obedience? And what if a mature human life requires the courage to hold meaning and criticism together? This is why the claim that Paul invented Christianity should not end as a cheap accusation. Its deeper significance is philosophical. Human beings create worlds of meaning. Paul did. The apostles did. Churches did. Philosophers did. And we continue doing it. Every generation inherits unfinished structures. We either repeat them unconsciously or participate consciously in reshaping them. The choice is not between having mythology and having none. Human beings interpret. We cannot avoid interpretation. The choice is between interpretations we understand and interpretations that control us because we have forgotten where they came from. Perhaps that is the challenge Spinoza leaves us. Do not destroy the sacred merely because human hands helped build it. Look carefully at those hands. Understand their motives. Understand their fears. Understand their historical circumstances. Understand the needs they were answering. Then decide what deserves to remain. If Paul transformed the memory of Jesus into Christianity, his act demonstrates the astonishing creative power of the human mind. But that same power still exists in us. We too transform what we inherit. Every time you reinterpret suffering, you create meaning. Every time you refuse an inherited hatred, you alter a tradition. Every time you replace superstition with understanding, you polish the lens. Every time you choose compassion over fear, something old is rewritten. The sacred, from this perspective, is not a fossil. It is not a museum object locked behind glass. It is a living human encounter with existence. And living things change. Perhaps the great question is therefore not whether Paul invented Christianity. Perhaps the deeper question is what we will invent from what we have inherited. Will we build another system that demands obedience? Or will we create forms of meaning capable of surviving questions? Will we continue dividing humanity between believers and unbelievers, orthodox and heretic, saved and condemned? Or will we become more interested in whether people understand, act justly, and live with compassion? Will we cling to certainty because uncertainty frightens us? Or will we accept that honest uncertainty may be closer to truth than inherited confidence? Look at your own life. How many ideas are truly yours? How many have you examined? How many survive only because questioning them would threaten your identity? What might change if you were willing to look again? Spinoza's invitation is neither blind faith nor fashionable disbelief. It is clarity. Look, ask, understand. Do not reject wonder. Refine it. Do not destroy meaning. Make it more honest. Do not abandon the sacred merely because human beings helped shape it. Recognize that perhaps the human capacity to seek truth, create meaning, practice compassion, and understand reality is itself what generations were trying to call sacred. Paul gave an ancient world a universal Christ. Christianity gave generations a language of salvation. Spinoza offered another possibility, a God not confined to throne, temple, or creed, but understood through the infinite order of existence itself. Between these visions remains the tension that still defines much of human life. Mystery and reason, tradition and examination, faith and understanding. We stand inside that tension now. The story is no longer only about Paul. It is about the person listening. You inherited a world already interpreted for you. Religious meanings, moral meanings, political meanings, personal meanings. But inheritance is not destiny. You can examine the lens. You can polish it. You can notice where it distorts. You can even replace it. And perhaps this is the form of freedom Spinoza would most urgently ask us to pursue, not freedom from all causes, which is impossible, but freedom through greater understanding of the causes that shape what we believe. So when you next encounter an idea presented as unquestionable, do not immediately reject it, and do not immediately obey it. Ask where it came from. Ask what problem it was trying to solve. Ask what fear keeps it alive. Ask whether it makes human beings more capable of understanding reality or more dependent upon authority. Ask whether it produces compassion or merely conformity. And above all, ask whether you believe it because you have seen its truth clearly or simply because someone polished the lens before you were born and told you never to look around it. Perhaps Paul helped invent Christianity. Perhaps every generation since has continued inventing it. And perhaps the question history now places before us is not whether we can return to some perfectly untouched faith. Maybe no such return exists. The question is what kind of meaning we will create with open eyes. Will we preserve illusion because it comforts us? Or will we risk understanding? Will we remain disciples of inherited certainty? Or become participants in the unfinished search for truth? That answer cannot be given by Paul. It cannot be given by Spinoza. It cannot be handed down by any institution. It belongs to the way you choose to think, to question, and to live. And perhaps that is where the sacred begins again.